some ways was seen as a symbol, not just of a new America, but of a new world. He was a young man. He was good-looking, a sort of mixture of Robert Redford and Steve McQueen. And I think people felt when he took over that the world had a new chance, and America had a sort of leader which would enable it to lead us forward into a better future rather than simply keep things under control.
Dennis Healey, a seasoned politician even then, was not immune to the widespread sense of loss.
The thing I remember very well indeed was sitting at home in Highgate in London and just hearing this terrible news on the radio, and I burst into tears.
I was horrified because I knew John F. Kennedy and thought very well of him. And it seemed to me, as it seemed to many people, that a light had gone out in the world.
As a political correspondent in America, Keith Kyle had got to know Kennedy before he became president.
I was anxious to know what sort of impression he would make. And he asked me out to lunch and drove me into the countryside in his car. It was a most alarming journey because Kennedy engages one in conversation very intensely. He has an extraordinary ability to extract from you anything that is worth knowing about a subject in a relatively short compass of time. He'd make a splendid television interviewer. And throughout this drive, he was looking at me full in the face, never once putting his eyes on the road, and he drove very fast.
In 1960, when I first arrived in Dallas, well, hadn't been there very long, of course there was the election, and they had the parades on consecutive days, and that car came to a complete standstill, so I ran out and shook hands with him and said something like, "Good luck, Mr. Kennedy." And he said, and it does sound so implausible, I'm almost embarrassed to tell you, because people think, oh, come on, you know. But he said something like, "You're from England, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you know, what are you doing here?" And so I said, "Well, I just came over, you know, for a few months to learn about the cotton industry." And so we had a bit of a chat, and of course you don't really know. I didn't know whether it was like a couple of minutes or 30 seconds or whatever. For a politician, I'd have thought this was probably unique. I mean, he talked about me rather than about himself, you know, because he seemed to be genuinely interested in what I was doing for a short period of time. So, obviously, after that, I wanted him to win the election so I could say, well, that's my mate John, you know, he's the President of the United States now.
He's so fine. Wish he were mine.
Kennedy brought glamour to the political stage, a place where people were not accustomed to finding it. And television had not previously found, on either side of the Atlantic, so telegenic a politician. As Lime Grove crumbles, Sir Paul Fox, who once ran BBC Current Affairs here, recalls the presidential magic.
He had a charmed relationship with the media. I mean, there's no question of that. The media adored him because he knew how to deal with them. He attracted the media, he attracted media people, and he was an impressive figure on television. I always remember he was over here on a visit to see Prime Minister Macmillan. Macmillan, after all, was a kinsman. He always called him Uncle Harold. I remember he was here, and it was the night of a panorama program. And I asked Ludo Kennedy to go and interview him. And Ludo did a most marvelous doorstepping job on President Kennedy.
I rushed towards him. When I saw the Secret Service people, so I thought, I wondered if they were reaching for a gun or something, because I just came out of the blue like that.
It wouldn't have been possible that any previous president, or presidents afterwards, could have been successfully doorstepped. And what's more, President Kennedy recognized Ludo and said, "Oh, I've just read your book about Notting Hill Gate."
Well, that was astonishing, you see. He didn't know I was coming. I mean, you can brief a president. You would say, oh, so-and-so's coming along, ask him, say that you know about this. He didn't know I was coming at all. And that was, of course, was very impressive.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Remember, the television at that time was not the powerful force it is today. But I did something after President Kennedy was elected that changed things in the direction of television by convincing him that he should have live television press conferences, something that had never happened with any president before.
Duty, and then they're called back. And
there was a real charisma. He had a sense of humor. We now know that this image of him as being very young and fit was quite phony. He was actually extremely seriously ill. in several ways. But he used to stand up and take questions at these press conferences. It was a performance. He was stylish. He was funny.
How is your aching back? It depends on the weather, political and otherwise.
The reporters who made the Kennedy reputation were also Harvard men and Yale men, and they got on like a house on fire with the Kennedy people, and they were very uncritical, actually. To be fair, I think a lot of these people now realize that they were seduced and sort of had by the excitement and the charm of the Kennedy coterie. But there was an enormous amount of uncritical journalism.
There are many Americans who believe that in our manner of questioning or seeking your attention, that we're subjecting you to some abuse or a lack of respect.
Well, you're subject me to some abuse, but not to any lack of respect, I don't think.
Thank you, Mr. President.
When the Black Watch played on the White House lawn on November the 13th, JFK had 9 days to live.
Well, it was a historic occasion for my regiment. I think the last time that we had been in the White House was when we burnt it down in 1812. It's a matter of interest, or so my Vice Major told me. We thought it'd be a nice gesture on behalf of the regiment if we could make a presentation to the President. So I made a very short speech in front of him before the performance of the bands. And we gave him one of our big regimental dirks with the regimental motto inscribed on it, which in the circumstances, with hindsight, of course, was certainly ironic.
I want to thank Major for this presentation of a dirk of the Black Watch. The Major just said that the motto of the Black Watch is, nobody wounds us with impunity. I think that's a very good motto for some of the rest of us. Thank you.
Fort Worth, Texas, on the last morning of Jack Kennedy's life. About him, as ever, the aura that made people talk of a new world Camelot, the charm and the wit.
2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting that same sensation as I travel around Texas. Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear.
And so to Dallas, and the shots that were to kill a president and stun the world.
Because you can't talk, because you can't walk, because your mother has only got one pair of hands, because you're wonderful, except when you're hungry, because you woke your mother 6 times last night, because you hate shopping. Because of all these things, at Tesco, we'll give you somewhere to get changed, your own custom-made trolley, and we'll even warm your milk for you. Tesco. Every little helps.
Hello?
Caterer, dinner party for 6?
I'm afraid I don't know where anything is. It's my boyfriend's flat.
Oh, that's okay. I've brought the essentials.
Who's that?
The caterer.
She's cutting it fine.
He.
Rich coffee aroma, smooth coffee flavor. Nescafe Gold Blend.
That was excellent. Thank you.
Oh, don't thank me. My sister's the caterer, but she's ill. I said I'd help out. So, how are you getting home?
Any more of that delicious coffee?
I'll get it. The caterer's just leaving.
Riding along in my automobile.
If you use petrol without detergent, this is what can happen to your engine. Carbon builds up, a major cause of poor acceleration, bad starting, and higher fuel consumption. That's why all Shell petrol and diesel has a patented detergent formula. Used regularly, it helps stop carbon building up, giving much better performance.
Riding along in my automobile, my baby beside me at the wheel.
Use Shell Advanced Petrol.
Kiss at the turn of a mile.
You can tell when it's Shell.
Luckily. Luckily. Grudgingly. Sick as a parrotly. Famously smooth. Tetley.
Elegant, prestigious, and indulgent. Gold is always desirable. Nothing feels or looks quite like it. Because cushion softness and generous thickness are the hallmarks of new Andrex Gold.
Because your mother asked us to, at Tesco we've moved all the sweets away from the checkouts. Sorry.
Washington, on the night of November the 22nd, 1963.
Finally, we arrived at the White House, and we had a prayer session. And then Jackie said, "Why don't you spend the night here at the White House? This has been a tough day for you." I had never spent the night in the White House. So I went upstairs, and there was Larry O'Brien, Ken O'Donnell. We talked till about 5 o'clock in the morning. Finally, I went to sleep. And suddenly, at 7 o'clock, the phone next to me rings, and the secretary is saying, "The president wants to talk to you." And the first thing that comes into my brain, "Oh my God, I've just had a terrible nightmare." And then I hear this voice saying, "Oh, Pierre, this is Lyndon." And I suddenly knew for sure that JFK was dead.
At the United States Embassy in London, on the morning of November the 23rd, a steady stream of visitors come to pay their respects. A stream that feeds a river of mourning worldwide.
In the period immediately after President Kennedy's death, Mrs. Kennedy received over 3 million expressions of sympathy and condolence from people around the country and around the world. These were in the form of letters, of spiritual bouquets and mass cards, and a very substantial number came from Britain, which was one of the countries which produced the largest spontaneous response to President Kennedy's death. Mrs. Kennedy received approximately 500,000 letters from people in the United Kingdom. A lady from London wrote, "Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I hesitated writing at once, as of course you will be inundated with messages, and anyway, there are no words at all. I am still wondering if I shall wake up and find that it was a bad dream. It's so impossible to believe."
Well, when I got a quiet moment, I thought I must write to that poor girl. Let her know that the whole world is looking and watching to hear some, at least small comfort for her. She had to have the love of everybody. It was only that was going to pull her through. You can have all the money in the world. They were a wealthy family. But you still need people. It's the feeling of others and the letting of you know that those people are there feeling for you. That's what brings you through these things.
Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I am writing on behalf of the staff and pupils of St. Augustine's Secondary School on the tragic and untimely death of your husband, President J.F. Kennedy. We have followed with great excitement his fresh, youthful, and wise approach.
Your dear husband will surely go down in history as the greatest man of our time. His steady toils for peace, his wonderful stand over Cuba, and above all, his Civil Rights Bill. Indeed, we have lost a good friend. He will long be remembered with love and respect.
Merseyside showed its respect in its own way. At Everton's ground, as at others on the day after Kennedy's death, a minute's silence before the game.
I think a lot of people were so horrified by what had happened that they were glad to be able to take part in some form of tribute. And I was over there in the Bullens Road stand, and the silence started, and it was almost, well, it was absolute. I couldn't even hear the traffic outside.
I've been watching Everton since I was about 8 years of age. I remember that day when they had the minute silence, a minute or 2 minutes silence. There wasn't a sound anyway. The bus was behind, couldn't hear a thing, and you know, it was just total silence. And next thing, this bloke jumps up, punches the air, shouts, "Long live Khrushchev." Next minute, it seemed to go in slow motion. Bloke hit him the back of the neck. He seemed to go down in slow motion, you know. And they were punching him, pushing each other away to punch him. And then they seemed to make a pathway for the policeman come along there, and the policeman, he just jumped over and lifted him over that wall there. I don't know, it's just a funny thing. It's just one of those things where it sticks in your mind. It just sticks in your mind.
That was the week that was over, let it go.
That was the week that was. For many viewers, the unmissable weekend show. Irreverent, provocative, funny. Its producer knew that this edition called for something else.
We were not doing a judgment on Kennedy. We were trying to reflect what immediately was the national feeling, and indeed it turned out, though we couldn't know that at the time, the international feeling that a light had gone out. When a light has gone out, you don't do an investigative report on the quality of the fuel.
A young man rode with his head held high under the Texas sun.
Ned stood me almost in silhouette. There's very little of me that shows, because I said, if I start to cry, I don't want that on the screen because I don't think it looks right.
Lord, he so goes riding on.
I always remember seeing that little tear, one tear coming down one side of the face, which I suppose symbolized the shock that most people felt at the time.
I thought it was, I'm very proud of that piece of music. I thought they did a wonderful job, and it was, I wish I didn't have to have sung it, but it was wonderful to do it.
At BOAC, some senior flight personnel were contacted urgently.
So I gave operations a ring, and I was told that I had to go out on a trip the following day. When I asked where to, they said, sorry, can't tell you. Well, where am I going? Sorry, can't tell you. How long am I going away for? I can't tell you. Well, you try telling a wife that you're going away, you don't know where to and how long for. It's not an easy question, but she was very understanding. Following day, I arrived at the airport, and I met the flight manager, who then informed me the circumstances. That we were to take the Duke of Edinburgh, the Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas-Hume, plus certain high officials from the Foreign Office, over to Washington for the funeral of President Kennedy. It could be described best as tense, because having lost one of the world's great leaders, I think it affected everybody. And obviously governments were wondering what was going to happen in the light of the assassination.
Royalty, heads of state, many of them much older than the murdered president, and thousands of ordinary mourners converged on Washington. John Kennedy had had just over 1,000 days to make his mark on history.
He made the American people feel responsible for the disadvantaged, the poor, the blacks, the people who were regarded as problem people in the previous system, but he made them feel that, that the American people were responsible for those who weren't as well off as they were.
As the first bitter pangs of our incredulous grief begins to pass, we must thank God that we were privileged, however briefly, to have had this great man for our president. For he has now taken his place among the great figures of world history.
Mrs. Kennedy asked me to send some pipers up to play the cortege from the White House to the cathedral.
It had been just 12 days since the Black Watch played on the White House lawn.
She knew that JFK had enjoyed the performance so much, and the children, that she would wish some recognition of that occasion at the funeral.
Family life plays a big part in everybody's life at some stage. It has to. And their time was then. I wonder how she felt inside. She must have been all torn apart.
John F. Kennedy seemed young, he looked good, he did the right things, he seemed to say the right things, he had a beautiful looking wife. And I think that's what the shock was. He was so young, and you felt he was one of the gang, really. Then suddenly he was taken away. And I think that's why I was in sort of shock. He was such a young lad.
Kennedy was so invincible, we thought, and the man who was going to defend the free world against all enemies, and there was a sort of air of optimism and strength and confidence everywhere, and it was just a shattering thought. You thought anything terrible is now possible.